How many years you been here?
What's that?
How many years have you been here?
Since 2001. You know, I don't need a lifestyle. I just want to be movable. And if I want to be movable, I got to move every day.
What's left on your bucket list, though?
Staying alive.
And welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure and delight to introduce you my friend and colleague, Brett Popplewell. Since you're here, you probably know he is the best-selling author of Outsider, which I'm really glad we'll be digging into tonight. But he's also an author of the book The Escapist and author of many, 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 many pieces of journalism in notable publications like The Walrus, The Globe and Mail, The Toronto Star, you name it. Some of my favorite pieces of his journalism are his investigative pieces, such as the one in The Walrus about the LRT gong show, something we can all relate to, or another piece he did about a Toronto doctor turned fentanyl drug dealer. And yeah, or a piece he did on the future of journalism, which won him a national newspaper award. So this man is full of great words and stories. So yes, let's welcome him. And I think what we're going to do to start off is Brett's going to read a passage of his book so that we can kind of contextualize Dag, this man he writes about. I'm going to ask some questions, and then I'm going to turn it to you. So definitely write down any questions you have, and you will have an opportunity to ask them of Brett. So without further ado, let's hear some of your words.
Okay, I should have marked the page. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for joining me on stage here. So I'm going to read. It won't take long. It's just it's about a 2-minute little passage here. It's from the prologue of the book, and I'll just set the scene that this is actually it's something I witnessed, and it was about 5 in the morning on a November night on the side of a mountain in the winter. I had been camping out in sub-zero temperatures to follow this man who was, at the time, he was 74. He's now 82 years old. So it begins with a quote from this man, and it's, "Old people need superheroes too. The last of the Ubermensch runs through the night alone. He carries no identification, but the scars on his face, hands, and body tell of an 80-year struggle to survive on the edge of society. He has been starved, abandoned, and trapped in a foreign land for nearly 50 years, unable or unwilling to get back to the place that made him. Conceived in war, he is the aged, mangled remnant of a darker time, and yet he is innocent." As he races past snow-covered hemlock, fir, and pine. The sound of frozen dirt crunching beneath his feet dissipates as he nears the edge of a cliff wall. His are not the only tracks out here, but they are the only sign that a human has been here. He plants his feet in the snow next to the paw prints of a mountain lion that stalks this hillside. He knows she's out here. He has seen her eyes watching him from the shadows while he runs. But the innocent mind has no fear, even when it should. Fingers gnarled, arms bloodied, shoulder shattered, teeth broken, heels battered. The old man keeps driving his body forward, one boot drop at a time. He reaches out and wraps his clawed hand around the dormant trunk of an aspen and uses it to slingshot his body away from the cliff's ledge and upwards, regaining the mountain line's trail as he makes for a frozen waterfall that few people have ever seen. To those who have seen him, his age, coupled with his tattered boots, gloves, and duct-taped jacket, project an image of vulnerability. His face, masked in a frosted beard, is chapped and weathered by decades of cold and sun. Long-haired and straggly, he looks as ancient as a man would, having lived in a school bus parked in a forest since the start of the 21st century. And yet buried within his aging frame is a strength that seems to keep him safe. So this is the beginning of the story of a man by the name of Dag Aabye, who is probably my most complicated friend. And well, let's jump into some questions, I suppose.
So Dag is clearly a super athlete. I mean, he's a stuntman. He runs marathons. He lives entirely off the grid. He seems to defy aging. How did you find this man?
So Dag sort of found his way to me as a myth, as a mythological creature. He was once upon a time, and still would be regarded as the world's first extreme skier. He was Norwegian born, and he's been living in a bus for 30 years. And he came up on my radar because he did this thing where he would run 125-kilometer ultra marathons as a 75-year-old. And a friend of mine, a colleague, I used to work at Sportsnet, and a colleague of mine was running in this as like a 35-year-old. And he came upon this man on a hillside who looked, as my friend described, looked like Jesus if Jesus had grown old. And he sort of planted himself in the mind of my friend because there was all these people competing in a race that takes 24 hours to complete. And there's one person doing this that stands out from everybody else because of his age. So my friend started to ask some questions like, who is that man? And he learned like, oh, well, that's Dag. Dag used to be a stuntman. Dag was in James Bond movies. Dag is the first star of Whistler. Dag lives in a bus. Dag is basically like a Sasquatch. Like people see him, but then they lose sight of him and he sort of disappears, wanders back into the forest. So that friend came back to Toronto and years later, at a moment in my career where I was sort of down and out, and there's nothing sort of really more desperate than a journalist who doesn't have a story to tell. And I was just sort of a journalist who didn't know what my next story would be. And my friend told me about this man, and suggested that I might want to go out and find him. And so that's how I got onto the trail of seeking out Dag.
That's incredible. You're actually really known for writing great profiles of people, and you often go to great lengths, but not the lengths that you went to profile Dag. What was it about this man that got under your skin to the point where you didn't just write a profile in a magazine, but you wrote a book?
I never did write a profile of him in the magazine because he was too complicated. When I met Dag in 2015, I was really fascinated. I wanted to get an understanding of how he did what he did, how it is that a man was living off the grid in a school bus on the side of a mountain. And let me just contextualize that a bit. There's a romantic sort of view that I had of a guy living on a bus with like a wood stove in it that's sort of puffing underneath the trees and the snow. The moment you get close to that bus, you realize how tough an existence that actually is. This is a man he has no toilet. He has no running water. He has no refrigerator. For heat, he relies on himself to chop the wood that is going to keep him alive every night in this bus. I was fascinated by how he lived and other journalists had reached out to him and tried to follow him to get a sense of like how he does what he does and how he's pushing the limits of the human body to the extremes, to try and continue to run 125-kilometer death races as a 75-year-old. It was in meeting him and chasing the sort of how he does this that I realized the actual more difficult question to answer is why. And I kind of fell into this journey of following Dag for 8 years by listening to an answer to a simple question that I posed to him that really threw me for a loop. I asked him on our first meeting there, we're up on the hillside. I asked him, and I'd been really sort of intrigued by the Thoreauvian aspect of his life. And I asked him if there was anything in this world that he wanted, like an object. And I expected him to say nothing. And instead, he responded and said, "I wish I had a photograph of my mother." And I have always, in every piece of journalism that I do, anytime I set out to write somebody's story, I always end up asking them about their childhoods, because I think that that helps me to understand more about who they are as an adult and in the present by going back to the beginning and learning about their origin story. And so when Dag told me that he wished he had a photograph of his mother, I all of a sudden was sort of in this frozen forest, thinking maybe I've touched upon something here. Maybe this answer has kind of revealed a little bit as to why he is here, because he was living very much sort of an alien existence. And so I asked him the follow-up of, well, what do you know of your mother? And he said, well, I know that she was a Norwegian woman. And I said, what do you know of your father? And he said, well, I understand him to have been a German soldier. And then I figured out, like, well, he was born very shortly after the invasion of Norway. And I don't know much about the history of Norway, but I do know some things about the history of ABBA, the supergroup. And one of the singers, Anna Frid, she was what's known as a Lebensborn child. She was Norwegian, and her parentage, her father was a German soldier. And when the war ended, her and her family, they basically needed to leave Norway for their own safety and go to Sweden. And that's how she became, she ended up in Sweden and meeting the rest of the group of ABBA. And so I started to wonder if this man was perhaps had a similar story, and if that maybe explained why he lived this way.
We dig into that a little bit more. I mean, to drop a bomb of, I think my father may be part of the Lebensborn is a pretty huge thing. And you went to great lengths to help him figure that out. Can you talk to us a little bit about what precisely you did to help him track down his past? Yeah. So, as a journalist, I we are sort of trained to kind of like use the same tools as historians, right? To go into archives, to search through any databases, any records that we might be able to find to answer questions and do research. So I started to liaise with different archives in Germany to try and track the name of his father, in Norway as well. And also in Sweden, because I had suspicions that perhaps there were a lot of Norwegian women who, after the war, and I'll just paint the picture. After the war, these children were essentially kind of stateless. A lot of them were institutionalized. The Norwegian, Norway as a country, just kind of abandoned a lot of these children. Those who had been adopted were adopted into German Nazi sympathetic families. And after the war, a lot of those families were standing trial for treason. The mothers, a lot of them couldn't sort of filter back into society in Oslo after the war. They would be singled out, and they'd have their heads shaved so that they couldn't just walk the streets, that they needed to sort of wear this. So a lot of them fled
to Sweden. So I was trying to trace the names that he had in his mind of who his parents were and see what I could find. It is extremely difficult, actually, to do this kind of research, because ultimately, when all of us die, or we will all die, what you leave behind is essentially like little records whenever you checked into something, like when you crossed a border, or when you signed a marriage certificate, or when you appeared on a baptismal record. So I was chasing like these documents that don't really amount to much to sort of tell you who somebody was in life. That could only get me so far. And then ultimately I needed to go to Norway and bring this man with me who, and I should say, like, when I first encountered him, he had no identification. So how do you bring somebody with no identification back to the place where they came from? You have to help them get identification. And you have to be very conscious of what you're doing, because my biggest fear was that I would help him to get to Norway to help solve some of these questions, and then not be able to get him back, to bring him back to back home. I didn't want to bring him out of the country and then strand him in Norway because he didn't have the proper paperwork to come back to his bus. So all of this was sort of weighing on me in ways that I've never had things like this weigh on me when I'm doing a piece of journalism. It became very personal very quickly.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, at some point, it's pretty clear when you read the book that you went from having a journalism source relationship to being friends. And, that's a really natural, understandable process when you're spending this much time, when you're helping him find his mother. But you're also a journalist, and you're trying to write a thorough, fact-check journalistic book, not a piece of PR. And so how did you confront that tension of having to write a book about somebody that you ultimately really care about?
It's very uncomfortable to be a journalist, if you have to try and be a journalist, to try and be detached from the people that you're writing about, if you start to have to form a friendship with them. It's why we try to, when we go to restaurants, we pick up our own tab. You don't want to be indebted to the people that you're writing about. Through the course of this, and some of my students are here, and like through the course of doing this, I kind of fell into this uncomfortable and kind of dangerous territory with this source where we became friends. I began to really care for him and worry about him. I would find myself waking up in the middle of the night, knowing that he's out there running endlessly through the forest, and wondering if he was still alive, because at any moment's time, he could fall and hurt himself. And he did fall and hurt himself several times while I was working on this, and become like increasingly battered. As a man who's trying to push the limits of what the human body can do, there's only so far you can take that. And there were several times where I would go to see him, and he was physically injured, like looked like he'd been almost beaten up, but it's because he'd fallen down. So I started to care for him as a person and consider him a friend. And I think I needed actually to cross that line in order to kind of validate the amount of work that I was doing on this to try and help him. If I didn't care about him as a human being, if I saw him simply as a story, I would have given up earlier and, moved on to an easier story to tell. There was also something that happened, and I talk about this in the book, and that I was exhausting a lot of myself trying to help answer this question as to his origin, essentially to help connect him to his mother, who is gone. And in doing so, while doing that, my mother developed stage 4 breast cancer and died. And so it became like a very personal experience for me when the relationship changed with this man, where I'm not just the one reaching out to him. He was reaching back to me to see how I was doing, because he knew what I was going through while simultaneously trying to help him on this journey.
Let's talk a little bit more about him and his personality, this essence that you became close to. I mean, he's kind of complicated. As I was reading the book, there was times I found him completely inspirational, and there were times that I found him somewhat delusional and tragic. And I guess I wonder how you approached writing about the more tragic, possibly delusional side of him. How did you do that with Grace as his friend?
It's very difficult when you're talking to somebody, when you're interviewing someone and you're asking them to share their truth and talk about things factually, and they start telling you things that don't check out with what you understand to be real. And this happened several times with Dag, especially when we would talk about some of his history, some of his relationships with other people, with his family and his own children. And I wanted to write something that captured his view of everything, his view of his life. And Dag, what I will say is that I view him as someone who has this kind of base level survival instinct in him that in order to sort of survive the way that he does, it requires him to always think positively and project positively on everything. So Dag lives in a bus. The economics of Dag's existence kind of force him to live in the bus. He doesn't really have an out. He couldn't really just move into society and live in a house. You can view that as unfortunate, or a victim of circumstance, or you can view it the way that he does, which is what a gift to live in the forest. What a treat to I have what more could I possibly need than a bus? I have a fire. I don't have a bathroom. Why would I need a bathroom? I have the forest. I have all of this here. He takes everything and he makes it positive. And I loved that element of him because it is the world in which he lives, but it is extremely hard to sort of square the corners of that when you talk to other people, like his children. When I spoke to his children, who explained sort of why they don't live in the bus, why he is there by himself, and sort of the world that he had and the family that he had, and why essentially they do not speak to him now. So in writing it and being friends with him, it was difficult because it wasn't meant to be a takedown of him, but I wanted to be honest to how he sees his life, but also the way that everybody else sees it and understands it. And so he wants to be inspirational, and he is inspirational, but at the same time, he is tragic and he has all these things. And so it was a delicate balance, I guess, is what I would say.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about reporting the book, because one of the nice things about being a journalist is that you can be a journalist anywhere, except where there's a terrible microphone. So you just need a laptop, you need a cell phone, but you kind of need your sources to answer the phone calls, or to be able to answer the phone calls. And here you wrote a profile of a man who lives off the grid, in the mountains, on the other side of the country, during a pandemic. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about actually how you managed to even speak to him on a regular basis?
Great question. So this was kind of like trying to report a story. And when I talk about reporting, I see, obviously, writing these kinds of things, there's two sides to it. You have to report it, which is like going to the source, doing the interviews, gathering the information, and then you come back and you write it. So the reporting side of this, through the process of this journey, I basically concluded that I might as well have been reporting a book 100 years ago, and that I could not telephone this man to ask him questions. I couldn't email him. The only way to ask him questions was to go to him. So I would have to try and line up a meeting place in the forest often, or on a road, by basically putting out feelers I'd send messages to the local pubs near where he lives, or to some of the people nearby him, to try and leave a message for him, to let him know that I am reaching out to him because I'm trying to come out and do a reporting mission. Sometimes I would hear back from him, sometimes I wouldn't. Sometimes what I would have to do is just buy a plane ticket, fly across the country, rent a car, drive into the mountains, and either locate him at one of his fire pits or go to his bus. And he gets up at 4 a.m. every day, and he goes and he runs until about noon. So I knew that if I go to the bus in the afternoon and I knock on the window, there's a chance he will be there. And if he's not there, then I just kind of have to hang out long enough until he materializes. So it was just a total analog reporting mission. And again, like teaching journalism at Carleton, it's often difficult, I think, for students to make that first leap to even like telephone people and try and ask them questions. I just have this all on my mind. Like it is incredibly difficult to report something like this, to have to go to them every single time. And then to try and fact check all of this also. It was just incredibly an incredibly long experience. I think I went out there about 15 times to do this reporting.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. And that is costly. It just became what I did on my reading weeks, over the holidays, some long weekends. Yeah.
So reporting was rife with difficulties. What about writing? How did that go? Was it at least simpler or more straightforward?
The writing of the book was I wrote the book 3 times. The first time I wrote the book, I wrote it largely in a palliative care wing in Ottawa, where my mother was dying. And I got about halfway into the book, and then she died. And I was sort of reading some of it to her because she was fascinated. She was always fascinated by what I was doing, by my work and the stories and the people that I met and wrote about. So I was trying to race to get it done so that it could be sort of the last thing that I shared with her. And I didn't get it done. And because of that, I kind of broke after she passed. I was sort of halfway through the text, and when things are going well for me as a writer, I can clock 1,000 words a day. If everything's going well, like I wake up in the morning and I sit down, I have my structure, everything ready, and I can get 1,000 days. So to write a book, you need 100 days like that, 100,000 words days. Those are exhausting. After my mom passed, I was having days where like I'd get a sentence. Like I just couldn't do it anymore. And I just had memories of where I was, and I'd go back and read and try and fix up what I had previously written. And it was just extremely painful. So my publisher gave me time and space to recover from that. And then I finally did finish draft 1 of the book, and I handed it into my editor, and she gave it back to me, and she was like, this is great. They tell you what you need to hear. Like, this is great. This is gonna work. Everything's gonna be okay. And then they sort of flip it over, and you see like it's just they've really gone into it. And what she basically said to me was that it wasn't working because I wasn't in the book. The book was entirely the story of Dag. And she helped me to understand that the book, it's the answers that he is able to provide are not what was driving the narrative. It was the questions that I was posing. And so she sort of opened up this gate that we keep closed often as journalists, which is, you don't put yourself in the story unless you have to go into that story. And she just opened up the gate and said, like, you got to be in the story everywhere. Because without you, he's not getting back to Norway. Without you, he's not solving this riddle. Without you, there is no book. And so then draft 2 of the book, I completely rewrote it and put myself in the story. And then in draft 3, I kind of brought my mom along with me because she sort of belonged in it, because the writing of the book was also sort of part of the book in the end. Like, I'm writing the book in the book, which is very weird. I've never gone that layer of like an inception in these kinds of stories.
So what does Dag think about the book? Has he read it?
What does Dag think about the book? So we're not allowed to share these things with, like, contractually, I wasn't allowed to share the book with him before the book was done. So the moment that my publisher gave me 2 copies of the book, I booked flights to Kelowna. I rented another car. I headed up the mountain and I brought it to Dag. And I said, I'm going to stay for 5 days. I know he's a fast reader. His bus is filled with books. I was like, I'm going to stay for 5 days so that we can talk through it. Because what I didn't want to do was just disappear on them, right? Like, just the book comes out and I never talk to them again. I've never been that kind of a journalist. I always go back and talk to the people after the story comes out, because they've given, they're fully exposed in my stories. So in those 5 days, every day I would go back to the bus in the morning and I would bring him a coffee, and I would ask him how he was doing with the book, and he couldn't get into it. He couldn't read it, and the first thing was it was the title. He was like, outsiders are, it's kind of a negative. Like, outsiders are, in the media, when we talk about outsiders, we're talking about people who have done something bad, like outsiders in society. And he was like, I'm not an outsider. And I understood what he was saying. And then he got to the subtitle, which is An Old Man, a Mountain, and the Search for a Hidden Past. And he was like, an old man? I'm not an old man. And I looked at him and I was like, I don't think you should read the book. But what, so I don't know if he has read the book. What I do know, what he did was I inscribed the version that I gave to him, and ultimately he's a journaler. He keeps journals every day. What he does is after his run, he goes back to his bus and he records in his journal the story of his day. And he looks back a year and he reads what he did a year earlier. And then he tries to make sure that today is as good as the day that he had a year ago. It's actually a really interesting way to live. In his journals, he laminates things all the time. And so he took the sort of inscription that I gave to him and he laminated it and put it in his journal. And then he took the book and he ran down to the local Kohl's, which is the only place to buy a book near him. And he brought the book to them because he wanted to make sure that they knew that his friend had written a book. And they were like, yeah, we know, it's sold out. And he was like, oh. Then what happened is he started to he wasn't sure what to make of the book, because he like, there's a lot in there. His whole life is in there. And he started to get people would recognize him because of the book. And there's some people have sort of started to figure out where he is based off of the descriptions in the book. And there was one day he was out for a run and there was a man standing on one of his trails. And Dag ran up to him and the man wanted to tell him how moved he had been by the story. I think, if I have this right, I think the man had survived cancer and was trying to be more active and just wanted to share how much Dag's story had meant to him. And so Dag called me to tell me that story, that he was, he wanted to know, he was interested in how other people were reacting to the book. The last time that I saw him was about a month after the book came out, and I went to pick him up, to knock on the window of his bus, and say, Matt Galloway on the Current wants to talk to us about the book. If we can get to a CBC outpost, bureau, I guess is what they call them. And he was like, "Oh yeah, cool." So we went to Kamloops to call in and talk to Matt Galloway on the Current, and at that moment he still had not read the book, and that he had it for sort of a month. So I think it is extreme. If someone came, if a journalist came and wanted to write a book about me, one, I would be very cautious with this journalist, and then I don't know if I would want to read the book either. No matter what, I would be interested in hearing what other people have thought about the book, but I don't know if I could read a book about myself. And so it doesn't surprise me that he hadn't, and if he still hasn't, it doesn't. I get it.
I have a couple more questions, but soon we're going to open it to everybody in the room. So if you have your question, feel free to line up near the mic. When do you think you'll see Dag again? Do you like what's next?
I hope to see Dag. Dag still means a lot to me. I hope to see him before the year is out. I think of him most in the winter, because the winter, I think, is the most difficult for the life that he lives. I do ski. I grew up skiing, and this book and his story kind of had me fall back in love with that sport. And so I hope to go out that direction to see him and to ski as well. I've been trying to ski some of the places where I wrote about in this book, because it's where he went, and so I'm still trying to sort of go and be in the places that I've written about, and I hope to see him. I do reach out to the people nearest to him, especially during the forest fires this summer. I had some people ask me if I knew how he was doing during the fires, and I was slow to respond, because I didn't really know. I didn't want to say, "Oh, he's doing great," if he wasn't. But he was in an area where they were on. They were told to be ready to leave, to evacuate, and I just sort of assumed that if he was ever in this zone that needed to be evacuated, I really do believe that he would just leave when the animals leave. Like, he's living such this natural existence, and his whole wish for how his story ends is that he doesn't want to end up in a retirement home. He wants to live in the forest until he dies, and then just lie down in the woods and become food. And knowing that about him, I just had faith that if it ever came to a point where his immediate surroundings were on fire, that he would have already left, that he would have left when the squirrels left. I guess that's just a faith that I have in him. I do believe in his ability to survive. There will come a time when I will go out there to see him, and I won't be able to find him. But I don't believe that it's that time yet.
My last question is, what is your lasting takeaway from this? How has writing this book affected how you will write your next book?
Well, I hope that the next book that I write is about somebody who has a telephone and email and is easier to get in touch with. But I don't know if it will ever be as personally moving an experience as this one was. I think that when I met Dag, I'm 40 years old now. I was 32 years old when I met him, and I was an extremely competitive journalist. And I was never happy as a journalist, because I only ever felt as good as my last story. which only sort of helps you in the moment. And in the moment that story's in the really far back there, you're in trouble if you're living this way, because then you're only going to feel as good as your next story. And so I was kind of stuck in this peak and valley kind of really, really like big highs and low lows. And when I met Dag, somewhere along this journey with him, I've sort of let some of that go over this 8-year journey. And I think that it's got to do with something that he explained to me as I was kept probing the story of his past. He kept sort of telling me, like, this is important stuff, like where we came from, but it's like, we really need to concentrate on where we are right now, what we're doing right now, and make sure that we're making the best of this moment. And I was always like, yeah, I know, but I need to figure out why we're here. And I think that was more me projecting onto him, because I've always been one of these people who focuses a lot on the things that have happened and like where I've been and what I've done. Sort of maybe think on it too much. And at the same time, sort of dream of this future and where I might be going and how I might get there. And the thing that I'm kind of least conscious of is where I am right now and what I am doing. And he, through the 8 years that I've known him, he's always been focused on where he is and what he's doing in the present. And there was this line that he said to a runner in the death race, and I think the context of it, if I have it right, and I might have it wrong, but my understanding of it is this: he came upon this runner who was really struggling, and he sort of stopped with that runner and said, look at your feet. It doesn't matter where they were or where they're going. It matters where they are right now. And then he just kind of kept running himself, like just kind of scurried off. And I think there's something there that that I want to hold on to, because I think that message for me is important. And so to go back to your question of like whatever I might do next, I hope that I appreciate the journey of whatever book I do next, if I do a book again, for what it is in the moment, and live it and enjoy it, as opposed to sort of struggle through it and until it gets to this point where it's fully shaped and I'm happy with it. Because it's the journey is it's torturous, but it's also sometimes it's all there is.